What's going on, Shervin? And am I saying your last name correctly? Is that Shervin Aazami?
Shervin Aazami, you got it right. Thank you all so much for having me.
Yeah, so I guess a good place to kick this off would be to give everybody a little bit of an introduction as to who you are, why you're running for Congress in the California's 30th, which for people who don't know is going to be the San Fernando Valley area.
The West San Fernando Valley. Thank you all so much to the Vanguard, Zac and Gavin, for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and your viewers. Again, my name is Shervin Aazami. I'm an Iranian American. I'm an immigrant. I'm a public health activist. I'm a husband. I'm also soon to be dad. Our wife and I are expecting our first child in June. Running for Congress in my hometown, San Fernando Valley, California's 30th district, to oust corporate Democrat Brad Sherman. We are running on a bold, progressive platform to uplift and empower the working class, dismantle white supremacy, and end corporate welfare. That's what we're all about. I grew up here in the San Fernando Valley in working class neighborhoods in Canoga Park and Chatsworth. And before tossing my hat in the ring to challenge our long-term incumbent, I was the head legislative advocate for a national indigenous healthcare advocacy org, fighting to make sure the federal government honored its treaty obligations to tribal nations and indigenous people. So happy to be here with you all. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We're super excited to chat with you.
Yeah, I guess that segues kind of quite nicely into one of the questions that I had for you, which is just to kind of, I guess for people who aren't familiar with your district and, a lot of people actually, aren't that familiar with the policies of their own congressional candidate. I'm wondering if you could kind of compare and contrast yourself with the current incumbent, Brad Sherman, who, from my purview, kind of, seems to be the kind of a standard establishment Democrat. I'm wondering if you could, kind of illustrate some of his policy history and, talk about what you would do differently in his shoes.
Oh, I would love to. Yeah. Brad Sherman has been my congressman for quite some time, for about 24 years. And during that time, he's done very little for our community. Apart from one bill last Congress that imposed further sanctions on China for violating the autonomy of Hong Kong. Prior to that, the last time one of Brad Sherman's bills were signed into law was when George Bush was president. And it was a name change to a post office in our district. Brad Sherman is one of those members who leads through co-sponsorship and he leads in jest. He doesn't actually do the work to bring forth the structural reforms our communities deserve. And when we think about all of the issues impacting working people in our communities, everything from lack of affordable housing to the crisis of unhoused community members, to folks being uninsured or underinsured, to not being able to save for an education, to having issues with immigration and feeling the terror of ICE impact our communities and arrest and deport people during a pandemic that's disproportionately impacting our Latinx community members, Brad Sherman's been silent. And on the topic of housing especially, Brad Sherman is literally the guy to do something about our housing issues. I say that because last Congress, Brad Sherman became the chair of the Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets Subcommittee on Financial Services. And many folks may know just right now, the Financial Services Committee is having a hearing on Robinhood and all of those issues. But more importantly, that subcommittee, Investor Protection, has jurisdiction over our federal housing finance laws. It has jurisdiction over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It has jurisdiction over U.S. securities, affordable housing laws, and so forth. Mm-hmm. And as soon as he became chair of that subcommittee, he started getting donations from BlackRock and Blackstone, private equity and asset management firms that are exacerbating the housing crisis nationwide and across the entire globe.
Yeah, these are the big time landlords.
Exactly. 98% of Brad's campaign contributions come from corporations, including weapons manufacturers, private equity firms, commercial banks, credit card companies, and so forth. Less than 1% of his donors are working people, whereas we have proudly accepted a no corporate PAC money pledge. I've taken a no COP money pledge, the no fossil fuel money pledge, the Green New Deal pledge, and the Patience Over Profits pledge as well. Brad Sherman is one of those legislators that leads from behind. He leads through lip service. He leads through co-sponsorship. And as someone who's advocated on Capitol Hill, when someone says, oh, I co-sponsored the bill, allow me to share what literally goes into co-sponsoring a bill. Let's say Gavin and Zac, you both are members of Congress, and Gavin wanted to co-sponsor Zac's bill. Gavin, your staff would send a one-sentence email to Zac's staff saying, yo, add my boss's name to the bill.
Yeah, and as we saw with the Medicare for All bill proposed by a couple of the progressive members of the legislature, that was co-sponsored by a lot of people that didn't end up going on to fight for that policy or really support it in a serious way. Even presidential candidates that literally had, healthcare platforms that did not include said policy.
Or raise their hand on the debate stage and ask if they supported the Medicare for All and now be the vice president. But anyway.
Yeah. Co-sponsorship is the floor, not the ceiling. So we don't need more co-sponsors in Congress. We need more advocates in Congress, folks who will work every single day to push these structural reforms forward. And you brought up Medicare for All. It's a great tangent. During the presidential campaigns, there was a lot of talk about Medicare for All. A lot of candidates that said they supported Medicare for All. Well, let's break down what we mean by Medicare for All. And the version that I support from Bernie Sanders in the Senate and Pramila Jayapal in the House. It is a single-payer healthcare system, meaning the government controls the way the healthcare system works. They become the insurer for all of the people, and private insurance is not able to provide supplemental plans that compete with a national government-run healthcare system that ensures zero cost coverage for all Americans, including our undocumented Americans, including for medical, dental, vision, long-term care, pediatric, maternal healthcare, and so forth. So long as healthcare operates as a business as opposed to a human right, we will not see a situation in which all Americans have the basic healthcare necessity that they deserve as human beings. And there were people like Pete Buttigieg and others that were kind of saying, Medicare for some or a public option. That's not Medicare for all.
No.
If it's not single payer, it's not Medicare for all. If it does not abolish private insurance, it's not Medicare for all.
Yeah. Well, Shervin, I had a question for you looking over your platform, and that's about housing for all, a policy that you mentioned, and that's, I think, extremely important to, Zac and I here at the Vanguard. And I was reflecting a little bit on the fact that maybe 4 years ago, if someone were looking at your campaign website and they saw that policy, it might really seem out there. It might really seem something that's not what people are used to in this country.
Radical.
Radical. But now I struggle to put myself in the mindset of anyone that wouldn't understand why a policy like Housing for All is necessary, is the moral and humane policy to pursue. And obviously that's mostly because of coronavirus and just the extreme inequalities it's perpetuated. And especially in California, there's obviously such a problem of houseless individuals. So I'm just wondering, do you think this is going to be an easy platform to sell now that we are in this interesting time? Do you think that it's going to be easy to convince people that the kind of leadership currently being offered is not enough, and that people do need to embrace these kind of progressive policies?
So, our campaign is focused on the policies that matter and transforming the way we engage in our political system to have a politics of community, of transparency, and really speaking to communities around. When we say housing for all, what do we mean? When we say Medicare for all, what do we mean? And really breaking down those policies and meeting people where they are at and talking to them and saying, for your community, for your family, for what matters to you, this is why these policies are important. I believe housing is an inherent human right. It is a basic necessity. To your point, Zac, saying that it was radical, to ensure someone's basic needs are met is not radical, in my opinion. Right. Uh-huh. And for so long, we've seen these structural reforms that just uplift and empower working people as radical because our system is controlled by corporations, the top 1%. And the policies that we enable and we create go to their profit, maximize their benefits and their bottom lines at the expense of working people. And you brought up the COVID-19 pandemic. Crises expose injustices. Yeah. Crises expose racial injustices. Here in California, before the COVID-19 pandemic, in Los Angeles County, before the COVID-19 pandemic, we had roughly 66,000 unhoused neighbors. And this year, the city, in partnership with the Federal Housing and Urban Development, the Agency Federal Housing and Urban Development, decided to cancel the annual count of houseless community members in Los Angeles, citing COVID-19 as the reason why they're not engaging.
We don't look at the problem; it's not there. It's the real reason.
Right. Exactly.
It's the same reason that Bill Clinton decided to recalculate how we determine the unemployment in America. Mm-hmm. You got to make it look like a winner when it's not.
Right. And, as a result of COVID, we know that millions of people, tens of thousands of Los Angeles, have lost their jobs, they've lost their wages, their healthcare, and even their homes. And this happened while we minted 46 new billionaires in 2020. America's billionaires collectively entrenched their wealth by over $1 trillion, higher than the stimulus package that we passed in December. So that shows you how our system is gained for the benefit of corporations and the top 1%. And in the first few months, in July of 2020 alone, right, the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had 140 unhoused community members die. More unhoused community members in Los Angeles die of hypothermia than in New York City and San Francisco combined. In sunny LA, we have more unhoused community members who die of hypothermia than in New York and San Francisco combined. And we think about the fact that—
Is that just because it's assumed, oh, it's sunny there, we don't need resources for homeless people, they can sleep on the beach, whereas in New York it's a little more obvious that people would freeze to death in the cold? I'm just wondering, like, how does that happen, right? How does it happen that more people an equally populated city that's extremely cold, right, versus LA? I'm just wondering if it's
because we divest from housing and we invest in policing and incarceration. Yeah. The LAPD budget is $1.8 billion, whereas Los Angeles got about $65 million in a statewide project called Project Roomkey. We prioritize incarceration and criminalization, not housing. That's not the approach we take. Just yesterday, LA City Council unanimously passed a measure that diverted $9 million in funds meant for public housing and put them into more policing and public housing developments. And while we've been cutting services for unhoused community members, we've been engaging in more policing, more displacement, setting up these special enforcement zones that allow the police to displace our unhoused community members with impunity. Just a couple of weeks ago here in our district, there was a young machinist. There's a great organization called West Valley People's Alliance that does incredible outreach and advocacy here in the West San Fernando Valley. And they brought to light the story of a young machinist who was displaced by police here in the Canoga Park neighborhood. All of his belongings were ransacked and thrown away. Jewels that are family heirlooms that he's been carrying with himself for years and years, just thrown away by impunity from police and him moved to another area. NIMBYs control the way our housing system works. And when we think about the generational impacts of redlining, Los Angeles is ground zero. You look at so many of the zoning practices here in the San Fernando Valley. The San Fernando Valley for a long time was a white enclave. As we created these redlining policies on the parts of LA, it forced a lot more wealthy white landowners to move to the San Fernando Valley. And so we have a lot more single family zoning in the San Fernando Valley. We don't have enough multi-housing family zoning. We don't have enough investments to create affordable homes for our low-income communities and for our unhoused community members.
Yeah, well, that's another thing I wanted to ask you about, right? I think a lot of times people talk about, the housing issue when it comes to, urban downtown Los Angeles, but this is a problem that expands, into what would be considered the suburbs. There's quite, because of what you've said, right? There's a lot of single family homes when the need is really to build more multifamily complexes that can hold, the population influx. I'm wondering, what's your strategy to kind of get the ball rolling on something like that? If you're elected to Congress, you mentioned policing, right? Gavin and I have talked about how this is really tough because you've seen how much more outpouring of support from the public can you really ask for as a representative to demand, a defunding of the police, a radical rethinking of our carceral system completely, right? In the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murders. The people, flooded the streets from coast to coast, right? Gavin and I are in Kansas City and, the Midwest, and, the streets were flooded here. I'm sure in the San Fernando Valley, there were massive protests everywhere. The people couldn't have been more clear. And yet, as you said, they continue to prioritize policing and imprisoning people who are displaced or, mentally ill, etc. In the face of all this, obvious public opposition. Gavin mentioned the obvious moral imperative of housing. I guess, how do we move the ball forward when so much
I think we are. I think we already are. Yeah. I mean, thinking about, there is so much progressive zeal here in the San Fernando Valley and across Los Angeles. We passed a measure called Measure J in 2019 that Black Lives Matter, Los Angeles, Justice LA, and so many other grassroots organizations were pushing for, that defunds the police and the sheriff's department, and puts that money into housing, healthcare, and other services. We also ousted a district attorney that had been fighting against Black liberation for years and years and elected George Gascon, that just in his first few days in office was already working towards being able to demilitarize our police systems and move towards a system of equity. And so there is such great movements across the entire country. There are programs in Denver that have been in place where instead of having police go out in a mental health crisis call or a substance use crisis call, we have counselors going out, we have community members going out. And in all those situations, they didn't have to bring police. We don't need guns to address mental health issues. We need counselors. We don't need cops in our schools. All that does is perpetuate the school to prison pipeline. We need to invest in services for our community members. And I think when we look at it from that perspective and think about when we invest in our communities, the return on our investment is substantial. And speak about how we move towards a system of compassion, of equity, of community. That's what our campaign's all about.
Yeah, well, I noticed that you've been endorsed by Marianne Williamson, as I think Zac mentioned earlier, and congratulations on that. That's a really big deal. Obviously, helping to get the word out about your campaign. You've also received the organization or the endorsements of a few organizations like the Catch Fire Movement and Blue America PAC. I'm wondering, because obviously we think you have all the right ideas here when it comes to ending private prisons and Medicare for all, housing for all, very important. Crucial policies right now. But obviously so many times with these congressional races, we see the big money opponent, the incumbent, the establishment, simply overpower progressive insurgency with money, with a media, with a larger microphone, essentially. And I'm wondering what your plan is to maybe force the media to cover you. And I'm wondering if that involves courting the endorsements of other similar groups, Justice Democrats, brand new Congress, things or other, people like Bernie Sanders. Are you trying to get his endorsement? I'm just wondering what your strategy is.
Yeah, no, very, very grateful and honored to have Marianne Williamson support Catch Fire, Blue America PAC, 90 for 90, and others. Our strategy is focused on our community. We're focused on our district. We're focused on our voters and meeting them where they're at and elevating their concerns, elevating their priorities. So I'm just laser focused on my community and ousting Brad Sherman. And the way we do that is by building a new political coalition, which is kind of the centerpiece of our campaign, registering new voters, tapping into progressives that are not voting for people like Brad Sherman, don't participate because they're demoralized by people like Brad Sherman that say, I co-sponsor Medicare for all, but continue taking money from organizations and corporations that are actively lobbying against passage of those structural reforms.
Well, he did have that awesome post office thing too. That's
Yes, thank you so much for 20 years ago changing the name of a post office. Super important. Yes, that's definitely also resolving our housing crisis.
Also, this just occurred to me, but since you are running on a very bold platform and supporting a lot of big policies, I'm wondering if you're at all worried about how Joe Biden and specifically in the Senate was won on this promise of $2,000 checks and other similar grand promises which have so far been failed to have delivered upon. Do you think this is going to maybe create a sort of apathy within voters that will they'll look at your platform and
I'll tell you this, running on a platform of saying, as soon as we're elected, as soon as we win the Senate, we're going to give $2,000 checks, running on a platform of fighting for a $15 minimum wage, and then shirking both those responsibilities as soon as you're elected to office is not a very effective strategy of turning out support in 2022.
No.
So we absolutely need to hold our elected officials' feet to the fire. Accountability is essential here. People have been left behind for too long. People have been demoralized for too long because of the failures of our government and how so often in all of these crises, they give lip service to the community while bailing out corporations in the top 1%. Enough is enough. We absolutely have to hold their feet to the fire. So if we're going to actually do this right, we need recurring 2K checks for the duration of the pandemic and retroactive going back to the beginning of the pandemic. And let me tell you something. Here in Los Angeles, we passed a $15 minimum wage about 5 years ago. It kicks in next year. But here's the thing. Over half of LA residents are renters. And according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, in order to avoid paying over 30% of your income to rent here in LA, you got to be making $38 an hour. Well, that's 2.5 times the minimum wage. So that's leaving behind service workers. That's leaving behind farm workers. That's leaving behind gig workers. And just last year, we passed a $200 million, Prop 22, that was financed $200 million by Uber, Lyft, and other gig economies, who added another $13 billion to their market share within a day of that law passing. And what have we seen come out as a result of it? We've seen supermarket change, bar gig workers from unionizing, barring their ability to engage in collective bargaining rights, to be able to have a living wage and fight for basic workplace protections.
And not just workplace protect, the bare minimum that was already fought for, that hasn't been hollowed out. These gig workers are getting completely exploited.
Absolutely.
We had the good fortune of speaking with UC Hastings professor Vina Dubal, who laid out the gig work economy and its exploitation awesome on the show, and it's one of these things where it's like, they literally are turning back the clock to all of the all of the tremendous workers' rights accomplishments of the 40-hour work week, the overtime benefits, company sponsor everything, company sponsored insurance. It's all gone, right? These people have access to nothing. And not only that, now it's tax season, right? People are going to be filing their taxes. And this is something that never gets mentioned. The way that Uber pays, or, insert gig economy employer, it pays their employees, it makes it extremely hard to file your taxes, especially as a low income person who is using every cent that you make from this company immediately. And what happens is, out of desperation, not through improper financial planning, do people get behind, and then they end up the most marginalized, poorest individuals who barely made $45,000 last year hustling their 16 jobs. They get in trouble with the IRS while Jeff Bezos pays fucking nothing. It's absurd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could not have said it better myself. And to think that these companies are threatening to close down their stores or lay off their workers if cities force them to provide hazard pay, a $2 hazard pay, a $4 hazard pay. It's ridiculous.
In a pandemic.
Yeah, during a pandemic, laying off thousands of workers during a pandemic. And as always, all these things disproportionately impact our low-income communities of color. They fall on Black communities the most. They fall on Latinx communities the most. They fall on Indigenous workers the most. That's the way it's always been.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Shervin, I guess one of my last questions for you is, are you going to try to, pursue a debate against your opponent? What's your real strategy for getting on people's radars, forcing them to pay attention to these issues that you have brought up that are so important, and really drawing attention to the fact that your opponent is borderline incompetent and hasn't really accomplished much?
It is essential for our community to make an informed decision about their candidates. And that means having as many opportunities as the community wants for community forums, community debates. Our team is actually in the process of putting forth a pledge saying that by primary date, June 7th, 2022, we pledge to engage in this many community forums and this many debates. Nice. And I challenge all of our opponents to get behind that and join those debates, because our community deserves to hear from their candidates, hear about why they want to run, the issues they want to address. That's critical to building a new culture of community and transparency in our political system, which is central to what our campaign is all about. And, we haven't really touched on this, but one thing I also want to talk about is how all of these issues are intersectional. For so long, our elected officials have been operating in silos and putting forth small ideas, incremental solutions, and put Band-Aids on bullet wounds. We need to be intersectional in all of our approaches and understand how housing impacts climate change, how climate change impacts education, how it makes healthcare, how our foreign policy impacts our immigration to our country, how the war on drugs has exacerbated healthcare conditions across the entire country, has perpetuated racial disparities, and created a system where we have the highest incarceration rates in the entire world, and how that also dovetails back with our foreign policy and the way we engage in further criminalization abroad. All these things work in tandem.
Absolutely. And I still have two questions for you, Shervin, while we have time. And I want to touch on both of those things that you mentioned right there. One, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about education. And there's something that you highlighted on your website. I believe you quoted Malcolm X, "Education is the passport to the future." And you've talked about the devastation to public schools, specifically in the Los Angeles County area. Budget cuts, segregation, essentially, white flight. All of these things compound to make it dramatically inequitable in the education system, right? And Gavin and I are both products of public education, and we're both, aware of the fact that it can be done if resources are allocated correctly, right? We're really fortunate to grow up in Johnson County, Kansas, where there's a robust public school system, but so much of the country that's just not that way. I'm wondering, how do we provide an equal publicly funded educational opportunity and kind of fulfill that obligation that we've promised everybody, but we've, slowly worked back on, and, really deprived people of the education that they deserve and that they're promised, being a citizen, or just anybody on the United States soil, citizen or not.
Right. I think a lot of it boils down to the fact that we've been privatizing our education system, just like we've been privatizing all other essential government services. Here in California, my high school, for example, and my middle school became charter. My middle school about 10 years after I graduated, my high school a few years after I graduated. And It's very, very concerning to me how charter schools, number one, they infringe on workers' rights. A lot of teachers in charter schools have a lot of limitations in being able to unionize and engage in collective bargaining. But at the same time, charter schools have very little accountability. They get taxpayer-funded resources, but aren't subject to the same taxpayer accountability measures that traditional public schools have. And at the same time, as you brought up, we've been divesting from our public schools. We've been flat funding our public schools, and that's exacerbated segregation in our schools because wealthy families, those who can afford it, will take their kids over into private schools or put them to well-financed charter schools. But low-income families, predominantly low-income families of color, don't have that luxury. And again, transportation is another major issue with this as well, where if we don't have close access to public transit, if you don't have bus systems in your communities, how are your kids going to be able to get to schools? And when we have property taxes financing our education system, well, that means low-income communities will have less money and higher-income communities have more money. And that further perpetuates these inequities in our system. And if we truly recognize that education is integral to our public health, to our economy, and our national security, well, then we should treat it that way, as a basic necessity, as a basic thing that needs to be fully funded. And that's why our platform calls for quadrupling funding for Title I schools, providing for full accountability with charter schools and public schools, providing universal pre-K and pre-kindergarten, and increasing funding for teacher development and for K through 12 arts programs. And another thing that I'm really excited about that our platform has is providing a federal pension for our K through 12 teachers. Because when I was doing research into public pension debt, I recognized how 86% of public pension debt is pension debt for teachers in particular. And that is a huge, huge barrier on state local funding going into higher teacher pay and more funding for school infrastructure, textbooks, resources, and so forth. So the economic fallout from COVID-19 especially has also led to public pension funds losing over $1 trillion in value. So what better way for the federal government to honor the essential role of teachers in our economy, in our school system, than to provide a federally backed pension that covers 70% of their salary? And the way I'm hoping to structure it is that by a teacher providing 15 years of commitment as a teacher, they would be entitled to 70% federal pension coverage of their salary. And I also want to structure it in a way where teachers don't have to pay into that pension. It'd be guaranteed to them so long as they commit to 15 years as a public K through 12 teacher. And I also want to provide that flexibility where, let's say someone's a teacher for a few years, they have a change of heart going to another discipline, but then a few years down the line, they're like, actually, in my heart of hearts, I really believe in teaching. Well, if they go back to it, they don't have to start from scratch. They already have however many years under their belt, continuing towards working towards that 15-year threshold to qualify. That's something that we're really, really excited about.
Yeah. I think 100% a robust overhaul of the education system is one of the really in all of the things that we're talking about, right? You kind of have to triage. It's one of the things that doesn't get spoken about enough. I feel like obviously COVID, the 500,000 people have lost their lives, etc. But yeah, I appreciate you making that a priority in your campaign. It's a very important issue. One of the last questions I had for you, and I wasn't sure if you had a comment on it or not, but so often. One of the other issues that's kind of sidelined from our purview and that, isn't often discussed, is American foreign policy. And you touched on it briefly. And I wanted to get your, perspective as an Iranian American. And, and from our view at the Vanguard, we've been, extremely disappointed in Joe Biden since he's taken office. One of the few things that I had held out hope for, and one of the final reasons why I did decide to vote for Joe Biden was because I thought that at least he would be able to kind of steer clear of the massive, just draconian, vile incompetence of the Trump administration, its foreign policy. And obviously I'm getting at specifically their policy towards Iran, right? Not assassinating leaders, the massive sanctions, this policy, leaving the Iran nuclear deal, one of the key foreign policy achievements of the Obama administration. Biden had a pretty clear path into the Iran rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. Considering the circumstances, it seems like the Iranian leadership was extremely lenient, waiting out the Trump administration instead of taking what was described by a lot as an easy layup of Joe Biden. he decided to kind of give him the cold shoulder and decide to, play hardball again and say, no, you're going to do the thing that we told you to do, except we're not going to follow our side of the deal. And maybe if you do that, then we're going to decide to hold up our end of the bargain. That's kind of our analysis on the show. I'm wondering, what your position on the matter is, and also, how you plan to raise awareness of the Americans, kind of robust imperialistic foreign policy abroad and the devastation that it's causing real people.
Well, as an Iranian American living in Los Angeles, LA is kind of warm-heartedly referred to as Tehrangeles. We have the largest population of Iranians outside of Iran. And yet our Congressman, Brad Sherman, continues to tout the fact that he was one of about 23 or 24 Democrats who voted against the Iran deal. In a letter he sent to our district last month, he still touted that. He also touts the fact that he was one of the only congressmen to allow Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to come to speak to Congress during the Obama administration, after it was not actually authorized by the president himself. Over a third of Rep. Sherman's campaign contributions come from the defense industry. I was a kid when Brad Sherman voted for the war in Iraq, voted for the war in Afghanistan. And he was the only Democrat to speak at a rally in 2019 in DC, hosted by the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq. They're an Iranian separatist group that, if you speak to my grandparents, speak to my family, they remember their political assassinations and their bombings in Iran during the Iraq-Iran war. They remember how the MEK abandoned the Iranian community. They remember all of that terrorization. And Brad Sherman spoke at their rally, a rally that also included Rudy Giuliani, Mike Pompeo, and John Bolton, some of the most hawkish neoconservatives in Congress.
Some of the most depraved individuals to ever, serve in the United States.
Our military-industrial complex and our endless financing of foreign wars is one of the major reasons why we cannot invest in housing, education, and healthcare here at home. When we have a $740 billion annual discretionary budget, and yet transportation, healthcare, housing, all these things are a fraction of that amount, our budgets are a reflection of our priorities. Our priority is imperialism. Our priority is incarceration and criminalization and financing foreign wars to line the pockets of corporations, not provide the needs of our communities. And so while I'm happy that the Biden administration put a moratorium on sales of arms to Saudi Arabia, and I believe the UAE as well, that needs to be made permanent. There's no reason we should be financing the genocidal war in Yemen. And at the same time, we need to hold the Iranian government accountable for its human rights abuses. I strongly support re-entering the JCPOA and making it permanent. And at the same time, removing those economic sanctions, because I truly believe that they're impacting the Iranian people more than actually loosening the power of the Iranian regime.
Well, that's the intent of the sanctions, right? From a militaristic and a political standpoint, what you're trying to do is make the people hate their own government, so that it's how the United States, supports democracy abroad, right? We sanction their people, starve them until they're willing to do just about fucking anything to get some food and medicine for their kids. Yeah,
exactly. Also, and the one democratically elected leader that Iran ever had was deposed by the CIA in 1953 because he decided to nationalize the oil industry.
Yeah.
So
also,
we need to go ahead.
I was just gonna mention too that today, I don't know if you noticed, but the amount of troops in Iraq has been gone up. They've added like an additional 3,500.
Status quo is back.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm just wondering if you plan on talking about foreign policy on the campaign trail for this congressional seat, and if you think it's an issue that is really on people's mind right now. I always wonder that as someone who's because I feel like when we're into politics, we think about these implications a lot, but maybe people that are working a full-time job and are super busy and don't have time to think about it. I'm just wondering if they're aware of these nuances.
Well, it's a little bit of both, right? And we have such diversity here in the San Fernando Valley. We have such a strong international community from all across the globe. We have such a strong Filipino population here, Chinese population here, Korean population here, Iranian population, Arabic population, and so forth. And we need to be able to address those issues. And like I was saying earlier, these issues are intersectional. Our foreign policy impacts our immigration platform, which impacts our domestic policies around housing, healthcare, and education, and so forth. So we cannot address these issues in silos. And so I hope to speak truth to power and speak to Brad Sherman's failure on foreign policy. And at the same time, he's also falling out of favor within his own party. Last term, as you all know, Jamal Bowman ousted Elliot Engel, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Well, technically, Brad Sherman is the most senior member on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he was vying to become chair. He scored a distant third in that bid. He's one of the most hawkish neoconservative Democrats left. And I believe not only is he out of touch with our community, he's also out of touch with the party as well, hopefully. We're moving towards a demilitarized system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you're clearly the best candidate in that race, and we look forward to continuing to cover your candidacy. I was wondering if you have any links to plug, Shervin, anywhere people can go to support you, maybe volunteer for your race. Obviously, it's so early, but it's cool that you're getting your foot in the door early, and hopefully generating some excitement and buzz around your candidacy.
We are, we launched an exploratory committee in September and then formally launched in January. And during that time, 62% of our campaign contributions came from within the San Fernando Valley, within our district. So we're speaking to the needs of our community. We're elevating their concerns, their priorities. We're going up against a very well-financed corporate Democrat, like I said, with over $2 million in the bank from his corporate donors, weapons manufacturers, private equity firms, commercial banks, and so forth. So our website, shervinforthevalley.com. You can sign up to volunteer on our website. You can also provide a small donation. We're asking for folks, if they can, to donate $20.22 for our 2022 campaign. But really, any amount helps. $1 helps, $5 helps. Whatever folks are able to donate helps us get our message out there, build a name recognition, and speak truth to power, and be able to work forth and get elected to dismantle white supremacy, end corporate welfare, and uplift the working class. That's what we're all about.
Well, here at the Vanguard, you have our support. We're really excited about your campaign, and super excited to see where it goes. And we'd love to have you back on as the campaign continues and hear more from you. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah,
Thank you all so much.